The other day, I was hanging out with my sister introducing her to the game Stray. I think Stray is a really good example of an accessible game. Its mechanics are simple enough that inexperienced players like my sister can get a good grip on them fairly quickly, but its interactions still remain interesting for someone like me who plays lots of games. On top of that, the game has an incredible atmosphere, rich and dense level design, and you get to be a cat. Stray also has something I love in games called diegetic UI. This is where aspects of user interface exist in the space of the game world. For example, when you walk up to an interactable in Stray, like a robot to talk to or anything you use B12 to engage with, your backpack lights up with a related image. I really enjoyed this and thought the UI in Stray was pretty top-notch, but after watching my sister play, I began to second-guess myself. So my sister doesn't typically play games like Stray that use a controller, and I started to notice that she kept looking down every time a button prompt showed up on screen because she didn't know where the button was. This reminded me of when I was first getting into games as a kid, and how I used to do the same thing. It also made me think about how so many games follow similar conventions in regards to controller UI, and how that can make those games less accessible to newer players like my sister. It's kind of funny, I thought Stray had some super accessible and engaging UI, but it still gave my sister trouble because she wasn't familiar with the conventions I've come to accept as standard. I still think Stray has some excellent design all around, but I'm also interested in exploring how we can potentially improve that design and make it more accessible. Later that same day, I decided to boot up Skyrim to try out a new build. It's been months since I last played and years since I played Skyrim with a controller, so I was super confused when I had to remember the controls, especially because the button prompts were all for Xbox and I was using a PlayStation controller. I had also remapped the controls to fit something that made more sense to me, so for about half an hour I kept jumping every time I wanted to talk to someone because of where X is on the PS4 controller versus where it is on an Xbox controller. Honestly, I'm kind of amazed that Skyrim still doesn't know what controller I'm using, especially considering the Special Edition remaster has been out for almost 6 years now and the game is still getting occasional updates. Side note, speaking of weird issues in Skyrim, has anyone else noticed that there's just a bird stuck in this tree, making like every bird noise at once? I've played Skyrim dozens of times, and it's always here. It isn't even off in some obscure region you have to work to get to, it's right on the way to Whiterun at the start of the game. By this point, I just assume it's some lesser danger or something. I don't know, Skyrim's weird. I might just have to make a whole video on it. Oh, what's this? It appears I've just handed myself a note from the future. I've stopped playing Skyrim with a controller because every time I quit the game, it changed my control scheme. Anyways, getting back on topic. My first thought was to make the game figure out what controller you're using and set the UI accordingly. But then I remembered, Stray does that, and it still causes issues for people like my sister who aren't familiar with controller layouts, so that's just a band-aid for a bigger problem. Plus, as someone who's made a couple of games, detecting controller types and setting up dynamic UI accordingly can become messy. There's got to be a more elegant solution that makes it easier on both players and game developers. And then I remembered Breath of the Wild. This is a game designed with younger audiences in mind, so a lot of tutorialization on how to use a controller is built into the game, and this is where some true UI genius comes in. Rather than just show the player a lone button divorced from any context of the broader controller scheme, Breath of the Wild plays the 200 IQ move of just showing the player where the button is in relation to the other buttons. This is so simple yet so genius. Not only does this design sidestep Skyrim's problem of assuming the player is using a specific type of controller, it prevents the problem my sister had with Stray, where she had to keep looking at the controller to know which button was where. Honestly, I'm kind of annoyed more games don't do this because it's such an obvious solution once you see it. Of course, this isn't the end-all be-all of UI design, but it's something that I liked enough to make a video about. How about you? What are your thoughts on this? Have you noticed any other really good or really terrible UI in games? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Also, I'd love it if you would subscribe and like the video. It helps motivate me to make more stuff. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more from me, check out my Twitter, where I post my art, music, and vague depression tweets. Anyways, thanks for watching.